I never imagined the day would come when my own children would look past me as if I were invisible. It wasn't a sudden vanishing, not a magic trick. It was a slow fade, like a photograph left too long in the sun, the colors bleaching out until only a pale outline remained. The outline of a mother, a wife, a caregiver. The outline of a woman named Rose, whose name was now just a sound they made when they needed something. This morning was a prime example. I sat at the kitchen table, the one my husband, Arthur, and I had bought 50 years ago, its oak surface a road map of our life together, scarred with knife marks from impatient sandwich making, dotted with faint rings from sweating glasses of iced tea, and one deep gouge from the time our son, David, had tried to carve his initials with a fork at age 6. The old regulator clock on the wall, another relic of our shared past, ticked with a labored rhythm, each talk a lonely footstep in the cavernous silence of the house. The sun, a pale, watery thing, filtered through the half-drawn blinds, striping the worn linoleum floor. In front of me sat a cup of coffee, cold and untouched. The faint, ghostly wisp of steam had vanished over an hour ago. David had promised to stop by. "I'll be there around 9, Mom," he'd said on the phone last night, his voice distracted, already halfway into his next task. I just need to pick up those old tax documents from the study. It was now past 10:30. This was the third time this week he'd made a promise to visit. The first was to fix the leaking faucet in the guest bathroom. The second was just to have lunch, a suggestion he'd made with such cheerful sincerity it almost made me believe him. But the faucet still dripped a steady, maddening beat in the quiet of the night, and the lunch ingredients I'd bought were wilting in the refrigerator. The phone on the wall, once the loud, demanding center of our family's universe, remained as silent as a stone. I sighed, a deep, weary exhalation that felt like it came from the very marrow of my bones. My shoulders, which I always tried to keep straight, sagged. The space around me was too big now. It was built for a family of 4, for the chaos of teenage years, for the joyful noise of grandchildren on holidays. Now, the walls seemed to have expanded, pushing me into a small, insignificant corner of the life that was once entirely mine. They had forgotten the sound of voices, of laughter, of arguments and slammed doors. They only knew the shuffle of my slippers, the hum of the refrigerator, and the incessant ticking of that damn clock. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back. I could almost hear it if I tried hard enough, the phantom echoes of the past. David and his sister, Claire, chasing each other around this very table, their shrieks of laughter so loud I'd have to pretend to be angry just to get them to calm down. The smell of cinnamon and baking apples on a crisp autumn afternoon. Arthur, his hand still strong, coming up behind me as I stood at the stove and wrapping his arms around my waist. "Smells good, Rosie," he'd murmur into my hair. Where had that woman gone? The one with flour on her cheek and a ready smile, the one who could soothe a scraped knee, solve a homework crisis, and have a pot roast on the table by 6 without breaking a sweat. She had been the sun around which my family orbited. They needed her warmth, her light, her constant, gravitational pull. But suns, I suppose, are destined to burn out, and when they do, the planets that once depended on them simply spin off into their own orbits, barely noticing the growing darkness. Arthur was upstairs, sleeping. His sleep was different now, a heavy, medicated thing that stole him away for long stretches of the day. The stroke 3 years ago had taken much of him, leaving behind a frail, confused man who looked at me with a stranger's eyes more often than not. My role as a wife had seamlessly morphed into that of a full-time nurse. It was a transition I made without complaint, because that's what you did. You cared for the people you loved. It was the bedrock of my existence. But the silence from my children was a different kind of burden. It was a neglect that felt pointed, personal. They were busy, of course. David was a successful lawyer with a wife, 2 kids, and a mortgage the size of a small country's GDP. Claire, a real estate agent, was always closing a deal, networking, her phone permanently attached to her ear. They had important lives. I understood that. I was proud of them. but was a 10-minute phone call, a real one, not the breathless, multitasking kind. Too much to ask? Was an hour of their time once a week an impossible sacrifice? I pushed the cold coffee cup away. My appetite had vanished. I stood up, my joints protesting with a series of small, creaking noises, and walked to the sink. As I rinsed the cup, I stared out the window at the backyard. The garden I had once so lovingly tended was now a riot of weeds and overgrown rose bushes. The thorns seemed to claw at the air, protective and angry. I felt a kinship with them. A car slowed on the street, and my heart gave a familiar, hopeful leap. I leaned closer to the window, squinting. But it was just the mailman, his truck continuing down the block without stopping at our box. The leap in my chest collapsed into a dull ache. It was this constant, flickering hope that was the hardest part. The hope that this time, the phone would ring. That this time, the car pulling into the driveway would be theirs. Each time it was extinguished, a little more of me went with it. I was living a life of perpetual waiting, and I was beginning to fear there was nothing left at the end of it. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound anymore. It was a presence. A heavy, suffocating blanket that was slowly, patiently, smothering me. And the most terrifying part was that no one seemed to notice I could no longer breathe. The days bled into one another, a watercolor wash of gray and beige. My life was a loop of quiet routines, each one anchored to the needs of others. I woke at dawn, the habit of a lifetime of getting children off to school impossible to break. The first hour was for Arthur. I'd help him from his bed, my hands gentle on his frail, bird-like bones. I'd guide him to the bathroom, my presence a steadying force against his unsteadiness. I'd patiently help him shave and dress, choosing a soft cardigan to ward off the chill that seemed to live in his skin now. Some mornings he was lucid, his eyes clearing for a moment as he looked at me. "Thank you, Rosie," he would whisper, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. On those days, a flicker of the old warmth would return to my chest, a reminder of the man I had married, the partnership we had built. But those moments were becoming rarer. More often, he was lost in a fog of confusion, mistaking me for his sister, or a nurse, his frustration bubbling up in angry, nonsensical outbursts that I learned to absorb without comment. After settling him in his armchair in the living room with the television murmuring in the background, I would prepare his breakfast. Soft-boiled eggs, toast with the crusts cut off, just the way he liked it. I moved about the kitchen with an economy of motion born from decades of practice. But the movements felt hollow now, automated. I was a machine programmed for caregiving. The long wait began after the breakfast dishes were washed and the morning medications were dispensed. The house would fall into a deeper quiet, broken only by the drone of the television and Arthur's occasional, fitful snores. This was the vast, empty expanse of my day. I would sit in the kitchen, a book open on my lap, but the words would swim before my eyes, unable to hold my attention. My mind was a waiting room. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for the sound of a key in the lock. Waiting for a sign that I was still a part of their world. I thought of my own youth, a time that felt as distant and unreal as a dream. I had been a bright girl, top of my class. I'd had a scholarship to a good college and ambitions of becoming a journalist. I wanted to travel, to see the world, to write stories about interesting people. Then I met Arthur. He was handsome, charming, and full of plans for the future. I fell in love, and my ambitions shifted. My new dream was a life with him. A home, a family. I didn't see it as giving up my dreams, I saw it as choosing a different one. And for a long time, it was a beautiful dream. I poured everything I had into that dream. When David was born, I channeled all my energy and intellect into being the perfect mother. I read every book, attended every parent-teacher conference, volunteered for every bake sale. I was the homeroom mom, the carpool driver, the tireless cheerleader on the sidelines of countless soccer games. 2 years later, when Claire arrived, I simply expanded my role. My life was a whirlwind of their needs, their schedules, their triumphs, and their tears. I was the fixed point in their universe, the one they always came home to. I was the keeper of their memories, the architect of their childhood. I remember one afternoon, Claire came home from school in tears because she hadn't been cast as the lead in the school play. I held her and let her cry, and then we spent the entire evening making the most elaborate costume for her role as third tree from the left. I poured as much love and attention into that tree costume as if she were playing the queen. My job, as I saw it, was to make them feel like the center of the universe. And what a demanding universe it was. My old hobbies were the first casualties. My watercolor paints dried up in their tubes. The guitar I loved to play gathered dust in the attic. Friendships faded, not from any dramatic falling out, but from 1,000 tiny moments of neglect. "I'm sorry, I can't make it, the kids have a game," became my constant refrain. Eventually, the invitations stopped coming. It was a sacrifice I made willingly, believing it was temporary. I told myself, when the children are grown, I'll have time for myself again. But then, just as the nest was emptying, Arthur's health began its slow, cruel decline. The vibrant man who could fix anything in the house started to forget things. The confident stride was replaced by a shuffle. My role shifted again, from mother to caregiver, with no intermission. My world, which had revolved around the children, now shrank to the circumference of our home, and then, as his condition worsened, to the space between the kitchen, the living room, and his bedroom. The bitterness was a new and unwelcome companion. It sat in my stomach like a hard, undigested lump. It was the bitterness of a promise broken, not a promise made by anyone else, but one I had made to myself. The promise of someday. It seemed someday was a horizon that receded the closer I got to it. My needs had become so invisible, I had started to forget I even had them. I was a supporting character in everyone else's story. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of old photographs, looking for one David had asked for, I found a picture of myself from before I was married. I was 20, standing on a beach, my hair wild in the wind, my arms thrown wide as if to embrace the entire world. There was a look in my eyes, a fierce, joyful spark of limitless possibility. I stared at that girl, a stranger with my face, and a profound, aching sadness washed over me. Who was she? What had happened to her fire? I sank down onto the floor of the dusty attic, the photograph clutched in my hand, and for the first time in years, I wept. I wept for the girl on the beach, for the woman who had gotten lost along the way, and for the suffocating weight of this long, lonely wait for a life that felt like it had passed me by. The tears weren't loud or hysterical, just a silent, steady stream, watering the dry, barren ground of my own forgotten heart. The first break wasn't a loud, shattering thing. It was a quiet crack, a hairline fracture in the foundation of my life that would eventually bring the whole structure down. It happened on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. I had spent the morning coaxing Arthur to eat a few spoonfuls of oatmeal and was now resting in my bedroom, the door slightly ajar to listen for him. I had a headache, a dull, persistent throb behind my eyes that had become my constant companion. Then I heard the sound of the front door opening and, for a moment, my heart did its foolish little leap. It was David and Claire. Their voices drifted up the staircase, and I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made me dizzy. They had come. They hadn't forgotten me. I started to push myself up, intending to go down and greet them, my headache already starting to recede. But their words stopped me. They were in the living room, directly below my bedroom, their voices clear in the silent house. "Is he asleep?" Claire asked, her tone brisk and businesslike. "Yeah, and she's probably resting. She looks exhausted," David replied. There was a weariness in his own voice that made my heart ache for him. He was a good boy, just overwhelmed. "She always looks exhausted," Claire said, and there was an edge to her words, a lack of sympathy that pricked at me. "Honestly, David, we have to start being realistic about this. How much longer can she handle him on her own?" I froze, my hands still on the bedspread. They were talking about me. About Arthur. My breath caught in my throat. "I don't know, Claire. What are we supposed to do?" David sighed. She would never agree to put him in a home. There was a short, sharp laugh from Claire. Not him. Her. Both of them. David, look at this place. It's starting to fall apart. And Mom. She's not getting any younger. Last week she forgot where she put her glasses for an hour. What happens when she forgets to give Dad his medication? She wouldn't do that, David said, but his defense sounded weak, uncertain. Wouldn't she? She's overwhelmed. It would be a kindness, really. We could find a nice facility, one with a good memory care unit for Dad. It would be safer for both of them. Claire's voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice she used when she was closing a difficult sale. She was selling them on the idea of disposing of their parents. My blood ran cold. A kindness? Safer? Or just easier? Easier for them. Then came the words that cracked my world open. Plus, Claire continued, her voice dropping a little, becoming more conspiratorial, we could sell the house. In this market? We'd get a fortune. It would solve a lot of my cash flow problems. And you could finally pay off that second mortgage. A heavy silence followed. I imagined David, my son, my sensitive, kind-hearted boy, standing there, processing his sister's cold, mercenary logic. My entire body was trembling. This wasn't just about my well-being. It was about money. About my house. My home. The place where I had raised them, kissed their scraped knees, celebrated their birthdays. It was just an asset to them, a line item on a balance sheet. David finally spoke, and his words were the final, fatal blow. He tried to make a joke of it, a flimsy shield against the ugliness of what Claire had proposed. Well, he chuckled, a hollow, tinny sound, at least we'd know she's in a place where someone can find her glasses for her. He was joking. My son was joking about shipping me off to a facility, about taking my home, my life, and liquidating it for his and his sister's convenience. The sound of his laughter, so utterly devoid of warmth, of love, of respect, echoed in the quiet of my room. It was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. I sank back onto the bed, the room tilting around me. I felt a sharp, physical pain in my chest, as if a heavy chain had been wrapped around my ribs and pulled tight. This was a betrayal so profound, so complete, it dwarfed every other hurt, every other moment of neglect. The missed phone calls, the broken promises, they were just symptoms of this deeper, more malignant disease. In their eyes, I was no longer their mother. I was a problem to be managed. A burden. A collection of assets waiting to be claimed. My worth, to them, had diminished to the point of invisibility. They were not just looking past me anymore, they were looking through me, to the value of the house that stood behind me. I sat there in the gathering dusk, long after I heard the front door close and their cars drive away. The headache was gone, replaced by a terrifying, icy clarity. The hairline crack had split wide open, and I could see my life for what it was. I was the keeper of a house they wanted to sell, the caregiver of a man they couldn't be bothered with, and the obstacle standing between them and their inheritance. The realization hit me not with a wave of sadness, but with a cold, hard impact. The long wait was over. There was nothing to wait for anymore. The love I had been hoping for, waiting for, was an illusion. And in the wreckage of that illusion, a new, unfamiliar feeling began to stir in the depths of my heart. It was a cold, quiet, and deeply liberating rage. For 2 days after overhearing their conversation, I moved through my house like a ghost. I performed my duties with a chilling precision. I cared for Arthur, cooked the meals, cleaned the kitchen. But on the inside, I was a block of ice. The rage I'd felt had cooled into a hard, clear resolve. The world had shifted on its axis, and I was seeing everything through a new, unforgiving lens. The photographs on the mantelpiece of my smiling children seemed to mock me. The finger paintings taped to the refrigerator, saved for 30 years, were artifacts from a life that no longer existed. On the third day, a Saturday, I found myself standing at the front door, my purse in my hand. Arthur was napping, his breathing steady and peaceful. I had no plan, no destination. I just knew I couldn't stay within those 4 walls for another minute. The silence that I had once found so oppressive now felt like a judgment. I walked past the familiar houses of my neighbors, past the park where my children used to play, and I just kept going. My feet, acting on some long dormant instinct, led me toward the small town center, a place I hadn't visited in years. I walked past the bakery, the hardware store, the real estate office with Claire's smiling, professional photo in the window. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth and walked faster. My steps finally slowed in front of the public library. It was a modest brick building, a relic from another time. I hadn't been inside since I'd brought David and Claire for story hour when they were small. On a pure, unthinking impulse, I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The immediate sensation was one of peace. The air smelled of old paper and wood polish, a scent that was both calming and invigorating. The library was quiet, but it was a living quiet, filled with the soft rustle of turning pages and the gentle hum of people lost in thought. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was anonymous. I wasn't Arthur's wife or David and Claire's mother. I was just a woman in a library. I drifted through the stacks, my fingers trailing along the spines of the books. It was like touching hands with old friends I hadn't seen in decades. I saw names I loved: Wharton, Austen, Woolf. I found the poetry aisle and pulled out a slim volume by Mary Oliver. I opened it to a random page and read, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. My one wild and precious life. What had I done with it? I had poured it into the lives of others, letting my own cup run dry. I sank into a worn armchair in a sunlit corner, the book open in my lap, and watched the people around me. A young student, furiously highlighting a textbook. An elderly man, lost in a newspaper. A mother, quietly reading a picture book to her child. They were all living their own stories. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of a desire to have a story of my own again. On a corkboard near the entrance, covered in flyers and community notices, one caught my eye. It was a simple, typed announcement: the Wednesday afternoon book club. We meet at 2 p.m. This month's selection, The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. New members are always welcome. My heart gave a strange little flutter. It wasn't the hopeful, painful leap I felt when waiting for my children. This was different. It was a small, tentative spark of curiosity. I hadn't been to a book club since before David was born. I loved Edith Wharton. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Could I do that? Just show up? What would I say? What would I wear? Guilt immediately washed over me. Who would watch Arthur? The meeting was on Wednesday afternoon, my quietest time, when he usually had his longest nap. But what if he woke up? What if he needed me? The familiar chains of responsibility began to pull me back. But then, the cold, clear memory of my children's voices echoed in my mind. We could sell the house. Find a nice facility. The rage, still simmering beneath the surface, burned away the guilt. They were planning to uproot my entire life for their convenience, and I was worrying about leaving the house for 2 hours. I tore the small paper tab with the contact number from the bottom of the flyer and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. It felt like a secret, a small act of rebellion. That wasn't the only step I took. On the walk home, I passed a small nursery and garden center. I stopped and looked at the vibrant flats of pansies and petunias. My own garden was a tangled mess, a visible symbol of my neglected life. On another impulse, I walked in, bought a small trowel, a pair of gardening gloves, and a single flat of bright yellow marigolds. When I got home, Arthur was still asleep. I went into the backyard and knelt in the dirt. I started with a small patch near the back steps, ruthlessly pulling out the thorny weeds, my hands digging into the cool, damp earth. It was hard work. My back ached, and my knees protested. But with every weed I pulled, I felt a release. I was clearing a space. Making room for something new. I planted the marigolds, their cheerful, sunny faces a stark contrast to the surrounding neglect. I worked until the sun began to set, until my muscles screamed and my hands were caked in dirt. As I stood up and looked at the small, tidy square of color in the midst of the chaos, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. It was mine. I had done it for myself. Walking back into the silent house, the familiar loneliness was still there. The problems with my children hadn't vanished. My life was still complicated and painful. But as I stood at the kitchen sink, washing the rich soil from my hands, I looked out the window at that tiny patch of yellow, a beacon in the twilight. And for the first time, the loneliness was tinged with something else. It was the quiet, thrilling, and terrifying possibility of a life that existed beyond these suffocating walls. A life that might still, after all these years, be precious. The week that followed was a strange dance between my old life and the new one that was tentatively trying to emerge. My daily routine with Arthur remained unchanged, a comforting, familiar rhythm in a world that had become unstable. But around this fixed point, small pockets of my own time began to open up. The flyer from the library sat on my bedside table, a silent dare. The patch of marigolds in the garden seemed to demand companions, and I found myself spending an hour each afternoon clearing more space, pulling more weeds, my body aching in a way that felt productive and good. One evening, after Arthur was settled for the night, I felt a profound restlessness. The television droned on in the living room, but I couldn't bear to sit in front of it. I went into the small den, a room that had become little more than a storage space for old bills and forgotten belongings. On a dusty shelf was a row of old, leather-bound journals, empty books I had bought years ago with the vague intention of someday writing in them. Someday had never come. I took one down, its cover a deep burgundy, and ran my hand over the smooth, cool leather. I found a pen in a drawer, sat down at the cluttered desk, and opened to the first blank page. For a long time, I just stared at it. What was there to say? Where would I even begin? Then, I just started writing. I didn't think about grammar or sentence structure. I just let the words pour out, my pen flying across the page. October 12th. I don't know who I'm writing this for. Maybe for myself. For the girl in the photograph on the beach. I need to make sense of the noise in my head. A week ago, I heard my children, my own flesh and blood, talking about me as if I were a piece of furniture they were tired of. An obstacle. A burden. David's laugh. I can't get the sound of it out of my head. It wasn't cruel, not really. It was worse. It was thoughtless. As if my feelings, my life, didn't even factor into the equation. Claire. Claire was different. Her words were like little chips of ice. Practical. Logical. And utterly devoid of love. They want to sell my home. They want to put me in a facility. A nice one, of course. A kind one. A place where I can be conveniently forgotten. I had to stop, my hand cramping, my eyes blurred with tears. But they weren't the tears of a victim. They were hot, angry tears. Reading the words back, seeing them there in black and white, made the betrayal real and solid, not just a nightmare I might wake up from. It was a relief to get it out of my head and onto the page. I kept writing, filling page after page. I wrote about my life with Arthur before he got sick, the good and the bad. I wrote about raising the children, the immense, all-consuming love I had felt, the sacrifices I had made without a second thought. Was I wrong to give so much? I wrote. A mother is supposed to sacrifice. A wife is supposed to care. I did my duty. I fulfilled my role. But in all that doing, I forgot to simply be. I was so busy being their mother that I forgot to be Rose. I think the guilt is the hardest part. The guilt of being angry with them. The guilt of wanting something for myself, even now. It feels selfish. It feels like a betrayal of the vows I made, the person I was supposed to be. Over the next few days, the journal became my sanctuary. Every night, I would retreat to the den and write. It was a painful process of excavation, digging through layers of duty, resentment, love, and disappointment. I confronted the bitterness I had been swallowing for years, the slow, creeping realization that the unconditional love I had given had not been returned in kind. Through this process of writing, a new perspective began to form, like a photograph developing in a dark room. I started to see my life not as a series of failures, but as a path I had walked. And I began to understand, in a way I never had before, that my worth was not tied to my usefulness. It wasn't something my children could bestow upon me with a phone call or take away with their neglect. It was mine. It had always been mine, buried under years of service to others. My perspective on Arthur began to shift, too. I still loved him, the man he was and the frail man he had become. But I saw the dynamic of our life together with a new clarity. My constant, selfless care had been necessary, yes, but it had also enabled the rest of the family to abdicate their own responsibility. I had become the sole pillar supporting the entire weight of his illness, and the strain was causing me to grumble. My care for him didn't have to be all-consuming to be loving. It was okay to carve out a piece of my life for myself. It wasn't selfish, it was necessary for survival. On Wednesday, my heart hammered against my ribs as 2 o'clock approached. Arthur was sleeping soundly. I had laid out his water and a snack for when he woke up. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my reflection. I had put on a nice blouse and a touch of lipstick, and the woman looking back at me looked different. There was a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, but also a spark of determination. The book club was just as terrifying and wonderful as I had imagined. I sat awkwardly at first, clutching my copy of The Age of Innocence, feeling like a new girl on the first day of school. But a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, who introduced herself as Margaret, started asking me about the book. And as I began to talk about Wharton's world, about May Welland and the suffocating prison of societal expectation, I felt something ignite inside me. My opinions, my thoughts, they were valid. Someone was listening. That night, back in the den, I opened my journal. The fear and guilt that had filled the first pages were still there, but now there was something else alongside them. A nascent sense of self. I picked up my pen, the feel of it familiar and comforting now, and wrote a final entry for the day. October 17th. For 50 years, I have been a wife and a mother. I have been a caregiver, a cook, a cleaner, a nurse. I have been the sun, the moon, and all the stars in their sky. But a person cannot be a celestial body. A person is made of flesh and blood, of hopes and fears and a heart that can be broken. My heart is broken. But perhaps it can be mended. Not by them. By me. I have spent my life defining myself by my relationships to others. It is time to learn who I am in relation to myself. Who is Rose? It is time to find out. The declaration in my journal felt like a turning point, a line drawn in the sand. But words on a page are one thing, action is another entirely. The first true test of my new resolve came sooner than I expected, arriving in the form of my daughter, Claire, who appeared on my doorstep the following week. She didn't call first. She never did. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, and I opened it to find her standing there, tapping an impeccably manicured nail against the screen of her phone. "Mom, I need to talk to you," she said, brushing past me into the entryway. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask about her father. Her focus was singular, intense. "I'm in a bit of a bind." I closed the door slowly, my heart starting a low, heavy drumming against my ribs. This was it. The old Rose would have been flustered, anxious to please, her immediate response a worried, "What's wrong, honey? What can I do?" But the new Rose, the one who had spent hours conversing with herself in the pages of a burgundy journal, stayed silent. I leaned against the door and simply waited, my silence a question in itself. Claire finally looked up from her phone, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes at my lack of an immediate, solicitous response. "Okay, so, Mark and I found the perfect house. It's an absolute dream, Mom, in a fantastic school district, but the market is insane right now. We need to move fast, but our current place hasn't sold yet, and we're a little short on the down payment." She gave a little laugh, as if this were a minor, amusing inconvenience. "So, I was hoping you could help us out. We just need a short-term loan. 50,000. I've already talked to the bank, with you as a co-signer on a bridge loan, Given the equity in this house, it's a slam dunk. There it was. The house. My house. Not a home, but a source of equity. A tool for her to use. I felt the cold clarity from the day I'd overheard her conversation wash over me again. The drumming in my chest steadied. "No," I said. The word was quiet. It wasn't angry or loud. It was just a simple, solid fact. Claire blinked, then laughed again, a brittle sound this time. "What?" "Mom, don't be dramatic." I said. "It's a loan. We'll pay you back as soon as our house sells. With interest, if you want." "The answer is no, Claire," I repeated, my voice even. I looked directly at her, not at the floor, not at the wall, but into her eyes. And for the first time, I think she truly saw me, and she was startled by what she saw. The familiar, accommodating woman was gone. Her face hardened, the pleasant mask dropping away. "What do you mean, no? I'm your daughter. This is for your grandchildren. Don't you want them in a good school district?" The guilt, that old, familiar monster, tried to rise up in my throat. It whispered that I was being selfish, cruel. That I was punishing my grandchildren for their mother's sins. I took a breath and pushed it back down. "Your children's schooling is your and Mark's responsibility," I said, my voice still quiet, but now with a core of steel I didn't know I possessed. "This house, and my finances, are my responsibility. And I need to think about my own future now." Claire's face flushed with angry color. Disbelief warred with indignation. "Your future? What future? You're here, taking care of Dad. What future do you need money for?" The words were out before she could stop them, revealing the ugly truth of how she saw my life, a static, finished thing. "That is none of your business," I said, and the words felt incredibly, terrifyingly empowering. "My finances are no longer a resource for you and your brother to draw upon whenever you have a whim." Now she was truly furious. The final vestiges of civility vanished. "Unbelievable. After everything I do for you. I'm the one who's trying to figure out a long-term plan for you and Dad, and this is the thanks I get? Maybe David was right. Maybe a nice, managed care facility is exactly what you need. Then you wouldn't have to worry about your precious finances at all." The threat, once overheard in secret, was now wielded as a weapon directly against me. A year ago, it would have shattered me. It would have sent me scurrying back into my box, begging for forgiveness, writing the check with a trembling hand. But I was not the same woman. I thought of the marigolds in my garden, of the feel of the earth under my fingernails. I thought of the words of Mary Oliver, of my one wild and precious life. I stood up a little straighter. "You will not speak to me that way in my own home," I said, my voice dangerously low. "The conversation is over. I think you should leave." Claire stared at me, her mouth agape. She was utterly blindsided. She had come here expecting a checkbook and a signature, and instead, she had run into a wall. A boundary. It was something she had never encountered with me before, and she had no idea what to do with it. Without another word, she spun around, grabbed her purse, and stormed out the front door, slamming it so hard that a photograph on the wall rattled in its frame. I was left standing in the sudden, ringing silence of the living room. My entire body was trembling, not with fear, but with a massive, terrifying surge of adrenaline. My heart was racing, my palms were damp. I had done it. I had stood my ground. I had chosen myself. The silence that followed was different from the lonely, oppressive silence of before. This silence was mine. I had created it. It was the sound of a cage door swinging open. I didn't know what lay on the other side, and the thought was petrifying. But for the first time in a very, very long time, I was not afraid of the quiet. It was the sound of my own life, waiting to begin. The slam of Clara's door echoed in the house for days. It was followed by a profound and unnerving silence from her end of the world. No angry texts, no follow-up calls. Just nothing. The void she left was filled with my own roiling emotions. Guilt, as always, was a persistent visitor, whispering in the lonely hours of the night that I had been too harsh, that I had broken my family. I wrote furiously in my journal, trying to untangle the knot of feelings, to convince myself that setting a boundary was not the same as building a wall. About a week after the confrontation, the phone rang. I saw David's name on the caller ID, and my stomach clenched. I expected an attack, a second wave of the assault, this time from a different front. I let it ring 4 times before taking a deep, steadying breath and answering. "Hello, David." My voice was carefully neutral. "Mom?" "Hi." He sounded hesitant, uncertain. "Listen. Claire called me. She told me about. Well, she told me you two had a fight." "We had a conversation," I corrected him gently. "She made a request, and I gave her my answer." There was a pause on his end. I could hear the faint sound of his children playing in the background. "Yeah, that's kind of what I figured," he said, and the lack of accusation in his voice surprised me. "She was pretty upset. Said you were being unreasonable." "And what do you think?" I asked, the question direct. David sighed, a long, weary sound that I knew so well. "Honestly? I think she's been treating your house like her personal ATM for years, and she's shocked that the bank is finally closed." The words hung in the air between us. It was an admission, a crack of light in the solid wall of their shared perspective. I wanted to talk to you, Mom," he continued, his voice softer now. "Can I come over? Just me. We could have a cup of coffee." Hope is a stubborn, resilient thing. Despite everything, it flickered within me. "I'd like that," I said. He came the next afternoon. He walked in looking tired and older than his 42 years. He brought me a small bouquet of daisies, a peace offering that felt both sweet and inadequate. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had waited for him so many times. I poured him a coffee, my hands steady. For a while, we talked about superficial things, his kids, his work, the leaky faucet he promised again to fix. Then, the conversation faltered, and a heavy silence settled between us. He was the one who broke it. "Mom. I'm sorry." I waited, letting him find his words. "When Claire told me what you said about needing to think about your own future, it made me think. And I remembered what I said that day about the facility." He couldn't look at me. He stared down at his coffee cup, turning it in his hands. It was a stupid, thoughtless thing to say. A bad joke. But that's no excuse. It was cruel. And I'm so sorry. Tears pricked my eyes, but I willed them not to fall. This wasn't a moment for my tears. It was a moment for honesty. "It wasn't just the words, David," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It was the feeling behind them. The feeling that I'm a problem that you and Claire need to solve. That my life is over, and I'm just waiting around for you to manage my decline." He looked up then, and I saw genuine pain in his eyes. He saw his own thoughtlessness reflected in my words. "I never wanted you to feel that way," he whispered. "I know," I said, and I did. David's flaw was not cruelty, like his sister's. It was a profound, self-absorbed blindness, a failure to see me as a person separate from his own needs and perceptions. But I have felt that way. For a very long time. I have felt invisible. We sat in silence for a long time after that, but it was a different kind of silence. It was a space where the truth could finally breathe. It wasn't about blame or recrimination. It was about seeing and being seen. He told me about the pressures of his job, the mortgage, the stress of raising a family. I told him about the loneliness, the endless waiting, the slow erosion of my own identity. For the first time in years, we weren't just a mother and a son going through the motions. We were two adults, talking. The relationship didn't magically heal in that one afternoon. The cracks were too deep for that. But it was a start. It was the reclamation of a different kind of love, not one based on duty and obligation, but on a fragile, new foundation of honesty and mutual respect. My care for Arthur began to change, too. I still tended to his needs with love, but I no longer allowed it to consume me. I went to my book club every Wednesday. I spent every afternoon in my garden, which was slowly beginning to transform from a neglected wilderness into a place of beauty. I did these things without guilt, and paradoxically, because I was no longer running on empty, The time I spent with my husband became richer, more present. I would read to him from the newspaper, even if I wasn't sure he understood, my voice a calm, steady presence in the fog of his illness. A few weeks later, David came by again. He didn't have an agenda or a request. He just came to sit with me, to have a cup of coffee. He talked about a case he was working on, and he asked for my opinion. He listened to what I had to say. It was a small, simple moment, but it was filled with a warmth that felt real and true. We were finding our way back, not to what we were, but to something new, something better. The progress felt slow but steady, a fragile peace settling over my world. And then, the mail arrived. Tucked between a circular and a bill was a crisp, cream-colored envelope. It was thick, heavy. The return address was not from Claire, but from a law firm downtown. My name and address were typed in stark, black letters. My hands trembled as I opened it. The fragile piece shattered into 1,000 pieces. The lawyer's letter felt like a declaration of war. It was cold, formal, and full of intimidating jargon. It spoke of estate planning, fiduciary responsibilities, and evaluating the disposition of assets. It was Claire's voice, filtered through the chillingly impersonal language of the law. She was demanding a formal accounting of my assets and a meeting to discuss the long-term management of the property, my home. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the newfound calm I had been so carefully cultivating. I was alone in this. David, for all his recent apologies, was still her brother. How could I ask him to stand against his own sister? The familiar feeling of isolation crept back in, threatening to swallow me whole. I sat with the letter at my kitchen table for a full day, the cream-colored paper mocking me. My carefully tended garden outside the window seemed a world away. I felt myself shrinking back into the old Rose, the one who was helpless and afraid. The next afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't the sharp, impatient rap of my daughter, but a softer, more hesitant sound. I opened it to find my next-door neighbor, Maria, standing on the porch. She held a covered casserole dish in her hands. "Rose," she said, her smile warm and her dark eyes full of concern. "Forgive me for bothering you. I made too much lasagna, and I thought of you and Arthur." Maria and her husband, George, had lived next door for 20 years. We were fenced neighbors. We exchanged pleasantries while getting the mail, waved when we were taking out the trash. Our interactions had always been polite, friendly, and completely superficial. "Maria, that's so kind of you," I stammered, taking the heavy, warm dish. "You didn't have to." "Nonsense," she said, her eyes scanning my face. She was a woman who didn't miss much. "Are you all right, dear? You look pale. I saw your daughter leave in quite a hurry the other day. And I see you in the garden every afternoon. It's looking beautiful, by the way." Something in her genuine, maternal warmth made the dam inside me break. I hadn't realized how desperately I needed an ally, someone outside the tangled web of my own family. My carefully constructed composure crumbled. "Oh, Maria," I whispered, my voice trembling. It's complicated." "Complicated is my middle name," she said, her smile gentle. "Let me put this in your kitchen, and you can tell me all about it. If you want to." And so I did. For the next hour, I sat in my own living room with Maria and, eventually, her husband George, a quiet, kind man with a thoughtful face, who she had called over. I told them everything. The overheard conversation, the fight with Claire, the new, fragile understanding with David. Finally, with trembling hands, I showed them the letter. Maria read it, her lips tightening with every line. She passed it to George, a retired accountant, who read it slowly and carefully. When he was done, he took off his reading glasses and looked at me, his expression serious but kind. "This is a classic intimidation tactic, Rose," he said, his voice calm and steady. "She's trying to scare you into thinking she has a legal right to make decisions for you. She doesn't. Not unless a court deems you incompetent. And from where I'm sitting, you are one of the most competent women I know." Maria reached over and took my hand. Her hand was warm and strong. "My mother went through something similar with my brother," she said, her voice soft with remembered pain. He thought her money was his inheritance, not her security. She had to fight him. It was the hardest thing she ever did, but it was the most important. She taught me that you don't owe your children your future. You owe them a good upbringing. And you, my dear, have paid that debt 1,000 times over. Their words were like a bomb on my raw, frayed nerves. They weren't just offering platitudes, they were offering validation. They saw my struggle, and they were on my side. They didn't see me as a burden or an asset. They saw me as Rose. That evening, they invited me over to their house for dinner. It was the first time in years I had sat at a dinner table that wasn't my own. We ate Maria's lasagna, and we talked. They told me about their own children, their travels, their lives. They asked me about my book club, about my garden, about the girl I used to be, the one who wanted to be a journalist. They listened, and they made me feel interesting. They made me feel seen. Over the next week, they became my lifeline. George helped me draft a simple, formal reply to the lawyer, stating that I was in good health, of sound mind, and that I would manage my own affairs. Maria checked on me every day, sometimes just for a quick chat over the fence, other times bringing over a cup of tea. My friends from the book club rallied around me, too. When I tearfully confessed what was happening, they responded with outrage on my behalf and offers of support. Margaret, the woman who had first welcomed me, insisted I join her for a weekly walk. I was building a new community, a chosen family, bound not by blood or obligation, but by genuine affection and mutual respect. These unexpected allies formed a protective circle around me, their strength reinforcing my own. They were the scaffolding that held me up as I began to rebuild my life. One evening, I was sitting in George and Maria's cozy living room, a cup of tea in my hand. The lawyer's letter lay on the coffee table, no longer a terrifying threat, but just a piece of paper. I was still scared of the battle ahead, but I was no longer alone. For the first time, I felt like I had a team, my own team, in my corner. I looked at my new, dear friends, their faces etched with concern and support, and I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let Claire's bullying go unanswered. I needed my own voice in this fight, a professional one. I reached for the phone book on their side table. "George," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Would you happen to know the name of a good lawyer?" The decision to hire my own lawyer felt like stepping across a threshold. It was a definitive, irreversible act of self-preservation. George recommended a woman named Helen Albright, who specialized in elder law. "She's smart, she's tough, and she doesn't suffer fools," he'd said. It was exactly what I needed. I walked into her downtown office a week later, with George by my side for moral support. The office was modern and bright, and Ms. Albright herself was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense air that I found immediately reassuring. She wasn't warm and fuzzy, she was professional and focused. I laid out the entire story, from the overheard conversation to Claire's legal threat. She listened without interruption, occasionally making a note on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "Rose," she said, her voice crisp. "First, let me be perfectly clear. As long as you are of sound mind, and it is abundantly clear to me that you are, your children have absolutely no legal right to your assets, your property, or your personal decisions. None. Their expectations are not your legal obligations. What your daughter is doing is a form of elder abuse. It's financial and emotional bullying, plain and simple." Hearing my situation defined so clearly, so clinically, was incredibly empowering. It stripped away the messy family dynamics and the guilt, and left only the stark facts. I was being wronged, and I had a right to defend myself. Over the next few weeks, with Ms. Albright's guidance, I took concrete steps to secure my future. We established a living trust, a legal fortress that would protect my home and my savings. I appointed George, not my children, as my successor trustee, someone I knew would honor my wishes. Then, we redrafted my will. I made sure Arthur would be cared for the rest of his life. I left a modest, equal inheritance for David and Claire, Enough to show that I was their mother, but not so much that it would be the windfall Claire was counting on. The bulk of my estate, I decided, would be divided among several charities I cared about, including a literacy program and the local animal shelter. Each signature on those legal documents felt like a revolutionary act. I was declaring my independence, not just emotionally, but legally and financially. A massive weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. The fear of being forced into a facility and having my home sold out from under me was gone. My future was now firmly in my own hands. With this newfound security, something remarkable began to happen. The energy I had been expending on fear and anxiety was now free to be used for something else. My world, which had been shrinking for years, started to expand. The idea for my rebirth came, as most important things do, not from a grand plan, but from a simple human connection. Through my book club, I met a woman whose elderly father, Frank, was recently widowed and lived alone. He was, by his daughter's account, miserable and cantankerous, refusing all her attempts to help. "He's just so lonely," she confided in me one afternoon, "but he's too proud to admit it. His family is all out of state, and he just sits in that big house all day." I heard my own story in her words. I thought of the crushing weight of a silent house. On an impulse, I said, maybe I could stop by and visit him? I could bring him some soup. If he throws me out, he throws me out. Frank was every bit as grumpy as his daughter had advertised. He opened the door a crack and glared at me suspiciously. But I didn't try to be overly cheerful. I just looked him in the eye and said, "Your daughter told me you were lonely. So am I. My name is Rose. This is chicken noodle soup. Can I come in?" He was so startled by my directness that he simply stepped aside and let me in. Our first visit was awkward. But I didn't push. I just sat with him in his quiet living room. I didn't ask a lot of questions. I talked about my garden. I talked about the book I was reading. And eventually, he started to talk, too. He talked about his late wife, about the war, about how the world didn't make sense to him anymore. I didn't offer solutions. I just listened. I started visiting Frank twice a week. I'd help him with his groceries, make sure he was eating properly, but mostly, I just provided companionship. I understood his loneliness, his feeling of being left behind. Because I had lived it. And in helping him, I found I was also healing myself. I was no longer a passive victim of neglect, I was an active agent of connection. This experience sparked an idea. There were other Franks out there. Other Roses. Lonely people, hidden away in quiet houses, feeling invisible. What if I could help them? Not as a nurse or a maid, but as a companion. A friend. With George's help on the financial side and Maria's enthusiastic encouragement, I decided to start a small business. I called it the Rose Companion Service. It sounded dignified and simple. I had business cards printed, my name and number under the simple motto, "For when you just need a friend." My first official client was Frank. His daughter insisted on paying me, despite my protests. My second was a woman recovering from hip surgery, recommended by a friend from my book club. My third was an elderly gentleman who just wanted someone to play chess with. My life took on a new rhythm, a new purpose. I was still Arthur's caregiver, but I was also a business owner, a companion, a friend. My life had meaning that I had forged myself, born from my own pain and transformed into a source of strength and service. One sunny afternoon, I went to the bank to deposit the checks from my first month of work. It wasn't a large sum of money by any means, not enough to impress Claire. But as I watched the teller stamp my deposit slip, a profound sense of pride washed over me. This money was mine. I had earned it. It was a symbol of my new life, my independence, my rebirth. I walked out of the bank and into the bright afternoon sun, feeling 10 feet tall. My phone buzzed in my purse. I looked at the screen. It was a number I recognized, but one I hadn't seen in a long time. It was Claire. I hesitated for only a second, then answered. "Hello?" I said. There was a pause on the other end, and then I heard her voice, smaller and more hesitant than I had ever heard it before. "Mom?" she said. "It's me." Holding the phone to my ear, the bright afternoon sun warming my face, I felt a strange sense of calm. The Claire on the other end of the line was not the imperious, demanding woman who had stormed out of my house. This voice was tentative, stripped of its usual authority. "I'm here, Claire," I said, my tone even, neither welcoming nor dismissive. There was a long pause, filled with the sounds of street traffic on my end. I could imagine her, probably sitting in her expensive car, trying to find the right words. "David told me. He said you started a business," she finally managed to say. The words sounded foreign in her mouth, as if she were speaking a language she didn't quite understand. "I have," I said simply. "Oh." Another pause. "He also told me. About the will. And the trust." "Yes," I said. There was nothing more to add. The facts spoke for themselves. She took a shaky breath. I was wondering if I could see you," she said, the request so different from her usual demands. "If I could come over and just talk." I thought for a moment. The old Rose would have jumped at the chance, desperate for reconciliation at any cost. But I was not the old Rose. Forgiveness wasn't a switch to be flipped, it was a path to be walked, and she had to be willing to take the first step onto it. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow afternoon at 2." She arrived exactly on time, another first. She didn't carry a briefcase or tap at her phone. She stood on my doorstep empty-handed, looking uncertain. I led her not into the formal living room, the site of our last battle, but to the kitchen table. I poured us both a glass of iced tea and sat down, waiting for her to speak. It all came out in a rush of words, disorganized and emotional. She talked about the shock of receiving the letter from Mile Oyer, the humiliation, the anger. But then her story shifted. She talked about the pressure she was under, the financial strain of keeping up with her lifestyle, the deep-seated fear of failure that drove her to see everything, and everyone, as a means to an end. It wasn't an excuse, and she knew it wasn't. It was, for the first time, a confession. "When David told me you had started your own business," she said, staring down at the condensation on her glass, "I couldn't understand it. And then I realized. You have a life. A whole life that I knew nothing about. I was so busy planning your future, I never stopped to think that you might want to plan it for yourself." Her eyes, when she finally lifted them to meet mine, were filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Mom. I am so sorry for the way I treated you. For the things I said. I was wrong." It was the apology I had once thought I would never hear. And I knew it was genuine. But I also knew that an apology couldn't erase the years of neglect or the deep wound of her betrayal. "I hear you, Claire," I said, my voice soft but steady. "And I appreciate you saying that. But things can't go back to the way they were. That life is over." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I know," she whispered. "I don't expect them to." That afternoon was not a magical reunion. It was the quiet, painful, and necessary beginning of building something new. A relationship with boundaries. One based on honesty and respect, not obligation and expectation. It would be a long, slow process, and I didn't know if it would ever be fully mended. But for the first time, there was a chance. A year later, my life had settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own. My companion service was thriving. I had a small, dedicated group of clients who had become my friends. I had found a deep and abiding purpose in offering the simple gift of my time and empathy. My days were full, not with the crushing weight of duty, but with the joyful cadence of chosen work and cherished friendships. My husband, Arthur, had passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months prior. I grieved for the man he had been, for the life we had shared. But I grieved as a whole person, secure in my own identity. My life had not ended with his. The house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a peaceful solitude, not a lonely emptiness. It was a space that was truly mine. My garden was a riot of color, a testament to a year of patient, loving care. On a warm summer evening, I sat on my front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was filled with the sweet scent of the roses that now climbed the trellis and the sound of laughter from the yard. David and his wife were there with my grandchildren, their joyful shrieks replacing the ghostly echoes of the past. Even Claire was there, sitting quietly on the porch steps. Our conversations were still careful, but they were real. She was trying. We were all trying. My circle of friends, my chosen family, was here too. George and Maria were arguing playfully over a game of checkers on the porch swing. Margaret from the book club was helping my granddaughter identify a butterfly. I held a warm cup of tea in my hands, no longer waiting for a phone call or a visit. My life was full. It was right here, all around me. I thought of the journey I had taken, from the invisible woman in the dim kitchen to the woman sitting here now, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. I had weathered the deepest of disappointments and had come out on the other side, not just intact, but stronger, more vibrant, more myself. I had learned to set boundaries, to reclaim my value, to stand in my own truth. I smiled, a deep, genuine smile of contentment. I was no longer a supporting character. I was the author of this beautiful, messy, precious life. I was no longer invisible, because I had finally learned to see myself. And in the peaceful solitude of my own heart, I knew I had created a life not just of survival, but of meaning. A life well lived.